All right, we're recording, yes? Are we on? Got the CB8 team.
You guys can, or Zachary can go through the pre-meeting talking points whenever, and then you guys can get started.
Yeah, thanks so much. Whenever you're ready, Zach.
Yeah, perfect. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. If this is your first time joining us, everyone will remain muted throughout the meeting except for the committee co-chairs and the presenters. Following the presentation, the co-chairs will call on members of the public wishing to speak. You can participate by going to the reactions icon, pressing raise hand, not the wave or thumbs up buttons. Only press it once. If you press it a second time, your hands will go back down. If you are on the phone, it is *9 to raise hand and *6 to unmute. Be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm unmuting once the co-chairs call on you. The chat is for technical support only to help with Zoom software problems, not to ask questions of the co-chairs. They will not see the chats. If you have an older version of Zoom, you will need to go to the participant section where you will find the raise hand feature there. Please do not raise your actual hand or wave at the screen because we may not be able to see you. Chat me, I'm here for support.
All right, there's your opening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Greg Morris. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Housing Committee. Ed, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Ed Hartog, the other co-chair. Welcome, everyone.
And our third co-chair, Rebecca Lamore, is in Albany, we know, and she said, I think she was going to try to join us, but she wasn't sure whether or not she could today because of her work life. And so hopefully she'll be able to jump on at some point. I am very happy and pleased. And by the way, normally we wait a couple minutes for people to get on board and stuff like that to have a full house here, but I just want to jump in and get going today because I think all our lives are busy and hectic, and the topic we're talking about is a critical one. So we continue a dialogue during the course of these housing committee meetings and recent conversations in particular, pivoting from how do we think about affordable housing in the district and see an expansion of that as that remains one of the primary district needs. And our last couple conversations, the last two meetings, have been really sort of targeted and focused on public housing. This is sometimes thought of as a district or community that perhaps doesn't have public housing, but as we've talked about in our last two meetings, it does. And what we know about the communities that our neighbors, is that what is happening in public housing, the way in which it is that public housing is not serving and not supporting, and the way in which the systems that have been created have not successfully supported the lives of those residents is something that this community board, this committee, and this community board, we hope, gets behind and thinks about in a different way. And we've been talking about that sort of, over the last couple of sessions, and I think they've been robust and interesting conversations. We thought, the committee chairs thought it would be beneficial to have, and I mean this, and I hope, Nicholas, I hope you're okay with this, a true expert is with us today to talk about, and scholar and professor, to talk about subsidized housing, particular public housing in New York City. Nicholas Bloom has joined us, professor of urban policy and planning at Hunter College, noted author, and you've got a new work coming out in 2023. Is that correct, Professor?
It is, yeah, the Great American Transit Disaster.
So you got your hands in everywhere, and I have a couple copies of some books that you've done specific to the public housing sector and the affordable housing in New York and those types of pieces. You are the one that gets called on to talk to us about tonight, to talk to about a little bit about what's working and what's not, how we got to where we are. And I think Ed, Rebecca, and I think it would be beneficial for this committee to learn more and sort of, we'll have some time for Q&A, but I think, Professor, we kind of want to start with starting with some questions and maybe giving you some chance to give your thoughts and reflections, and then we'll switch over to the Q&A. Is that okay?
Yeah, everybody? That sounds great. That sounds great.
Awesome. So just to tee it up, we'll start with an easy one.
Yeah.
From your perspective, what's the purpose of public housing? What makes it work? And what are we struggling with right now?
Right. So as a historian, well, good evening, and I am honored to be here, and I hope I can provide a little clarity, kind of particularly around the history and kind of how we ended up here with public housing in its particular situation in New York. But a lot of what I've written about, like this book, Public Housing That Worked, is about how New York was very different from, can you hear me okay? Am
Yeah,
I?
we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay.
Right.
So New York was very different from other American cities in pursuing public housing in terms of the scale, the quality, and kind of the vision. And one reason that it kind of worked and sort of took off in New York was that compared to other American cities, it really answered of a real need in the city in the early 20th century. So the people who were behind public housing, people like Mary Simkovich, the founder of Greenwich House, who goes on to serve as the vice chair of NYCHA in the early 1940s, and also she was one of the founders of the Housing Authority as a whole. She was somebody who basically had been involved in housing reform for decades before there was public housing. And that's because the housing conditions, as they are today, but back then, the housing conditions in New York City were just awful, right? And you're probably familiar with Jacob Riis's work and so forth. There had been, so basically there was a housing reform community that wanted to see higher standards for housing. And for decades, basically what they got were a series of tenement laws, which improved the tenements, if you will. They didn't stop the creation of tenements, but each sort of generation of tenements after 1901, in particular, got a little bit higher quality. But they still didn't sort of meet the kind of vision that the housing reformers had of a new kind of city. And people like Simkovich and others spent time particularly looking at Europe. And I think that's appropriate today because so much of like housing reform and advocacy is still based on like visits to Europe, and we hear about Vienna and so forth. Well, here's a big surprise for you. 100 years ago, when people wanted to see what could be achieved in like not just housing quality, but a new vision of community in a city, people went to Vienna. It was Red Vienna in the 1920s, and they were really impressed with the kind of quality of housing that the government was building for people in cities. And they were very inspired by this. Now, in the US, it was very problematic because we were so sort of private sector focused in this period. And so New York was an outlier, though. In 1926, New York State begins to basically very lightly subsidize private sector development of affordable housing. You're probably familiar with some of the labor union projects, they amalgamated and so forth from this period. So New York was way ahead of the country, but the country wasn't ready for public housing, for, housing built, maintained by the public. So, for instance, in the early 20th century, there were a lot of private sector kind of do-gooders, people like the Rockefellers and others who built kind of like model tenements, they were called, on a kind of like limited profit basis. Sound familiar? Right? It's sort of our basis of our contemporary affordable housing, right? It's like, 5% limited profit, things like that. So there was that, but it never really took off on the scale to be transformative. And the problem in New York, and compared to other cities, even in the 20s and the 30s, is you had basically arguably 1 million or more tenements. So the tenements, each new generation of tenements that had been created was a little better quality, but the other tenements were grandfathered in. And some improvements were required and things like that. But the city in the 1920s and 30s was still, particularly large stretches of neighborhoods, were still the tenements. Now, we can get into how good or bad tenements were. You talk to someone like Jane Jacobs, she loved the tenements and, things like that. But for the housing reformers, they were anti-tenement. They didn't like the density of them. They didn't like the quality of services in them. They didn't like the overcrowding, kind of like the lack of social control. They were very controlling. People like Simkovich, right? They wanted a different kind. They had a vision not just for housing, but for a new kind of community life. But they couldn't really get this off the ground in the U.S. For decades until you have the crisis of the 1930s, right? And so the Great Depression is the watershed for public housing in New York. And, it's not that, people like Roosevelt actually preferred single family homes in many ways, but he brings all these New Yorkers to DC, and that's their opportunity under the guise of a work program, right? We're going to put people to work. What are they going to do? Well, they'll do roads and hospitals and all this other schools, right? but they'll do housing too, right? We'll build this housing. And, it was about relieving unemployment, but really it was about for people like Simkovich and others, it was about redesigning the city, right? They were going to use federal money to basically rebuild neighborhoods, but either in the central city by clearing tenements. And in this way, they were very similar to Robert Moses, who was emerging as the real power broker in the 1930s. But also outer sites, like you look at Queensbridge houses and so forth. Like they were going to basically build a new kind of city. And then this is where we get into why NYCHA looks the way that it does, right? People often say, well, NYCHA is very barracks-like, right? It looks very simple or things like that. And that's because there were kind of limitations on what could be spent on ornament and things like that. The goal of the housing reformers was that the luxury of the housing would not be in exteriors, right? Would not be like, if you look at tenements, they have nice details, things like that. All the luxury goes into the community plan. And the community plan is all about being low density. Even in the center, even in Manhattan, right? You've been, it's very low. If the tenements were, 1,000 persons per acre, right? The NYCHA projects, the early NYCHA projects were 200 persons per acre. So that was basically, it was about reducing density, introducing trees and lawns and these very hygienic, kind of like bomb-proof, like buildings built for the ages. Of course they had, New Deal labor and things like that. So, and everybody who lived in public housing, they got every room. If public housing, every room has a window to the outside. Everyone had hot and cold running water at a time when a lot of people didn't, right? You had centralized heating plants. But that was just part. So the physical vision was about creating this kind of the lungs of the city, right? Opening up neighborhoods or creating new neighborhoods that would never be that dense, right? That basically the other side of it was, this tremendous fear in public health. Right, because this is before antibiotics. This is when TB was a terrible scourge, an untreatable disease in the city. And so this low density green environment with lots of air, and right, this was all about hygienic housing to basically end the sort of the disease of the slums, right? And they had a lot of ideas, right? There would be no more crime with public housing. There'd be no more disease. Everyone would get along, and so forth. But they never left in New York. So this is when we get into where New York is a little bit different, maybe from some other cities which pursued this. They didn't have the tenements so much in most other cities, the same density, other issues. But also, it was extremely paternalistic. That is, they were extremely selective in who could live in public housing. They were racially segregated projects. They were also, whether they were Black or white families in this period, they were, they would research their backgrounds. You had to be married mostly had to be employed, even during the Great Depression. And so they would go and collect the rent weekly at people's doors and look in. It was very intrusive, right? You could be evicted for, a variety of different things, and so it was kind of like this community planning, but then there was this social control was a very big part of the public housing model in these years. And part of the reason for this is they wanted to create this, again, this kind of model housing and, create this vision of a new kind of city. Now, in the 1940s, the Public Housing Authority isn't directly taken over, but essentially its growth is guided by Robert Moses, who had a different vision of public housing to a great extent. His interest in public housing wasn't really humanitarian. It really was about, well, I'm going to knock down like all these neighborhoods for highways and all kinds of stuff like that. And I need to be able to say in my reports, like, well, these people moved to public housing, this 20%. All right. So it really became a kind of quantitative piece post-war, post-45. So then they start building, these real, even larger and much taller projects which save money. more higher elevator buildings came in, and it was very much focused in the early, in the late 40s around returning veterans. There was a massive housing shortage in the city. And so now public housing had this new role. Its new role, well, yes, there was still the tenement clearance was part of it, but now it was like housing for heroes, like the returning veterans and GIs and so forth, and a kind of stepping stone, right, to, whether it was the suburbs or wherever they were going. So you have that's when basically almost all NYCHA's projects were built from 1945 to 1965, let's say, in that period. Talking about 180,000 apartments. It's like unbelievable, And they were so, even though Moses was kind of, running the thing from the side, he had, he put chairs in place and things that he supported and so forth. But it was, where am I going with this? They were extremely opportunistic in many ways. They used city-owned land to build these. They used eminent domain extensively to take property from private owners. They used federal funds, but there was also a city public housing program, which would basically use the rents of tenants to basically finance the housing. There was a massive state public housing program. And that's why New York becomes so big as a public housing program. It's not just federal public housing. It was state public housing, it was city public housing, and it was built wherever they could find a good site. It's like an old airport in the Rockaways. Sure, let's build it there. Can anyone get into the cities? No. We're just going to build it there. Like wherever they could find a site, they took it. And so that's when you get this like steamroller, right, of public housing. It's like it's an enormous enterprise by the 1960s. And I'm kind of going through fast if you want. I've got a lot of details on these sorts of things. But what's interesting about New York until the late 1960s is even though you have the kind of creation of the typical high-rise housing projects you see all around America during this period, NYCHA continued to pursue its paternalistic approach. Even as, for instance, by the late 1950s, it's a majority non-white population in public housing, and certainly in the 60s, almost a very high percentage of the white population left for the suburbs or other housing because they didn't face the kind of restrictions in the private market that Black and Puerto Rican families did in this period. But those Black and Puerto Rican families were just as carefully sort of like vetted into the late 1960s for public housing. Did they have jobs, married, all this sort of stuff? So it was kind of like again, this kind of elitism of public housing into the late 1960s. And for that reason, for instance, NYCHA had better rent collection than most other American cities, had lower percentages of tenants on public assistance, had lower crime actually than most public housing in other cities. And it really was considered also the management, because they had the money, they're collecting the rents in this period, things like that. They had the money to reinvest and kind of keep up the lawns. And it was a very tightly run operation. But obviously that didn't really fit with like the late 60s zeitgeist of how things should be, right, with public benefits, right? Because in the late 1960s, much like we have today, I mean, there was essentially a homeless crisis, but people were put in what were called welfare hotels. And so the welfare department was spending all this money, millions of dollars, to put people in hotels. And, public housing was like, yes, it was a primarily non-white system of residents, but they were, people were working and, basically they didn't seem like the group that needed public housing most of all. I guess that's what I'm getting at, right? So there was enormous pressure to change who could live in public housing, to allow people who, were single parent families, for people who were on public assistance. I mean, it was very legit, in terms of meeting a humanitarian need. Why should people have to live in hotels when there are people living in apartments who could afford to, rent in the private sector? They should be prioritized, right? The need should be prioritized. So in the late 60s, there's a change. And so then you begin to see a kind of different NYCHA develop in this period. Rent collection will not be as strong. You begin to have more financial issues. You have inflation as a problem. You have increasing social disorder in public housing projects that had not been kind of built for social disorder in the past. And so, what happens in the 1970s and 80s is NYCHA backpedals. They have, and if you know today, like even now, they have the working family preference, right? To try to kind of like keep that kind of social mixture in public housing. They seek any kind of funding they could, right? So they take like their city and state projects and shift them over to the federal government, right? So they can get subsidies there. And they tried their best to kind of maintain the system, even though it was very clear by particularly the 1980s that public housing, many of the public housing, not all of the public housing developments, but many of them had significant issues around crime, particularly around drugs in the 1980s and 90s. So there were, and at the same time, what's going on, and I think this is, we can kind of talk about this some more, but, you know, doing this history rather rapidly, but because so much of NYCHA's portfolio was built in a 20-year period, and it's so big, that in this sort of era of the late 90s and into the early 2000s, when you basically needed a lot of money to recapitalize and rebuild the projects, because all these other cities had kind of like nationally had gotten out of public housing funding declined nationally. And so NYCHA was left with this enormous portfolio compared to other cities, right? 180,000 units, where a city like Chicago knocks down a lot, tens of thousands of units of high-rise public housing, Baltimore does, and so forth. And so NYCHA kind of like stewarded these developments, but their problem was that not only do they have like growing social issues, but then they have all these maintenance problems, some of which, you know, I think there were some real management issues, but a lot of it is just like, if you live in an apartment building, you know, it's an expensive operation to run an apartment building, right? I mean, and especially after 20, you know, some of the first projects were in the 30s. When you get to projects that are built in the 30s and you get to the 1990s and 2000s, you're looking at a full, like, you really need to fully rehab these places, all right? So they were basically out of luck in terms of the national picture, right, of sort of financing. So, I mean, to sort of sum up what is a kind of very detailed and belabored history, I suppose, what made sort of NYCHA very famous in the period when it was considered to be a well-run housing authority were a lot of things that, frankly, people would not be very comfortable with today. Right, a kind of moralistic, paternalistic approach to managing families and people, an emphasis on rent collection at all, you know, as a primary goal, operating more like a real estate operation, right? That was sort of the model, and at the same time, there were some really nice things about what NYCHA, I think, added to the city in terms of greenery. When we look today, where's most of the tree canopy in a lot of neighborhoods. You have, you know, the trees that were planted, the lawns, the apartments themselves, when well maintained, are really nice, especially for the price, which is $500 on average across the portfolio. And really, this NYCHA is the last. And if you want to talk about what works today, right? Well, we can talk about what doesn't work today, but by preserving that portfolio for so many decades, you know, 8 decades or whatever, I mean, it's the last frontier of the, you know, the low cost apartment of $550 on average. It's the most endangered, you know, thing in New York City, with an average family income of $24,000, right? So that's success in a way. And, you know, the key is to fix the places and preserve it. And of course, upgrade the life for people who live in these developments. So I guess I'll leave it there.
So that's a good. Go ahead, Ed. Go ahead. Do you want to weigh in with Ed?
Oh no, I was going to ask you 2 things. And Greg, if you, I know before the meeting we had a series of questions, and I don't want to interrupt the flow. But you touch on 2 things. One is the cost of the land in terms of building all this public housing, like you were mentioning, you were building in a lot of different places. And if you could also touch on something about.
Can I just start on that one?
Sure. I didn't want to.
Before I forget.
Well, if you roll into it, also is the rent, because one thing I remember specifically when I was in grad school, and I won't say how long ago that was, but the professor in economics used to talk about New York City in particular because of the uniqueness for land and for rent, because we're on an island. And in most suburban areas, when I grew up in Northern Virginia, you can just go all the way down to Fredericksburg, right? You can just keep building and go all the way to
traffic.
You can just keep building to Richmond if you have to, which, you know, on down 95. But in Manhattan, you can't. And so to the point was, how you got housing and rent control and rent regulation because of the uniqueness of Manhattan and New York City in terms of you having to go up as opposed to out. And if you could weave that in.
Sure.
That's all.
So, I mean, the land cost piece is really interesting. So in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, compared to today, land costs, even in Manhattan, very low. And in fact, the evidence of this are, a lot of the, some of the famous post-war redevelopment projects. They were able to purchase like whole blocks at prices that like are just unbelievable today. So land costs were definitely lower, but the other side of it is that's also because there was less, the city was like on the edge in this period, so there was less demand, right, in the city. But the city was not beyond using eminent domain, because they had to provide fair market value for the property that they took. But again, you're talking about tenements and things like that, which they were clearing. They were considered to be, the value of the land itself, not the building above, that much, right, in this period. Because there actually were a lot of abandoned tenements in the 1930s because people didn't even want to live in them then, So they definitely, I was talking about this as opportunistic. They were definitely like, okay, if there was land available that was like in the central area, like Lower East Side, right, or Upper West Side of Manhattan, which was considered a slum at the time, right? It was very rundown. They would, basically take this land through eminent domain, and the reason they could do it was that the land values, or the building, the property values were so low in the post-war slump, right? That basically people couldn't rent because of the, for instance, the tenement house laws got more and more restrictive. If you owned an old tenement, like you would have had to invest in it. Like, well, why would I invest in an old tenement? But there wasn't necessarily the demand for redevelopment like there is today, right, for that lot. So a lot of people were happy to like sell off their property to the city. Not happy, but they, like there were objections here and there. But overall, they're like, I'll take my check and go, right? So that's very important. The other thing is there was a lot of undeveloped land within the city, or like former industrial sites like Queensbridge, which were kind of like these derelict industrial sites. You think about Lower East Side along the waterfront, that was the former port area, but you didn't need, the old gas house district, and, it no longer had a kind of economic rationale, right, for the old warehouses and things like that. So there was a lot of that land. And then there were a lot of like, city related parcels, or parcels that they could get, like racetracks or the amusement park for Co-op City and things like that. There was a lot of land that really hadn't been fully developed, right? So I think that's a big difference. And that's one reason why too, you definitely see a contrast between like Manhattan projects are much higher density by and large than a lot of the projects further out. Because the land costs were usually higher still. They were higher than the ones further out. They were still much lower than today, right? So they did factor that in, right? Land costs were a factor, and then they would go higher very often, create more dense housing on the Manhattan sites. You'll see this quite clearly, where many of the, the outer borough sites are like just land, just like it's just like, you can have sheep out there and stuff. Like, it's so much open space. And when I say that, I mean, it's not atypical even in Manhattan, where 85%, 90% of the land is unbuilt today, right? And so again, that reflects that land costs were much lower, right, in this period. But Manhattan has slightly, you'll see a slight more density there because of higher land costs. But it still was so driven by this idea of like creating a new kind of city that it's not as influential as it probably should have been, right? They would have thought more creatively, right, about, instead of just putting these towers and open fields, even in Manhattan, if the land costs have been higher, like we look at affordable housing today, they got to be a lot more creative, right, in how to like jam these units onto smaller sites. Right. But back then you had these big sites that are like, okay, we're going to do like we see it in Europe. Right. We're going to do these big tower blocks, everywhere. It was kind of like the same plan everywhere. Right. That saved money for them. It's just kind of serial duplication of design. And they didn't really think about, on the downside of all this. Right. They didn't really think about, how does this look to neighbors? What's the connection to the neighborhood? Right? What does it mean when you have like a fully residential area and no nearby shopping? right? No shopping integrated in these buildings, right? Very often. They only have a few early on, they did it. But like, what does it mean to build a neighborhood with no shopping, right? And one of the classic design flaws of NYCHA, right, is they were so selective in the tenancy early on, and they hated the city around them. So if NYCHA projects, you very often have to go into the inside of the block for the entrance, because it was this whole little utopian world they were creating. Well, that's great as long as there's no, crime in the public housing project, which there wasn't for many years, very little. But as basically crime went up in public housing projects, then people were basically, like going into these very large super blocks, right? And there were no stores, right? Late at night, it was dark, a lot of stair halls. So it was like a design, and they did it all over the place, right? Instead of just orienting the doors to the street, right? They created this whole kind of utopian world in their view.
So let's pivot. We've done a little bit on history. We've done a little bit on land. Let's pivot to your thoughts about right now. What you've laid I think the foundation for some of the complexities over time and the changes over time.
Yeah.
I mean, within this committee structure, we've talked about the absence of financial support on a number of levels. You also hit that note. But and also, I think we the inability of NYCHA to manage its service portfolio and its to take care of the developments in the way that have been necessary. And I guess at this point, you also referenced, I think, in our back and forth a little bit about policy change and those types of things. But I'm curious at this point, taking a step back. I mean, look, New York City is unique right now in terms of having this portfolio, unlike other cities. And I guess I'm curious as to where do you think we are now, and what are your thoughts about what this city has to do better at this point? The city and state, I should say.
Things are moving fast on that one today.
Yeah.
Right. The trust model. Well, I mean, on the one hand, right. So NYCHA has this unique problem, right, which is having maintained this enormous portfolio of public housing, right. There is no equivalent federal program to reinvest in public housing. And the reason is that in other American cities, public housing is no longer an important program. And I can't say that enough, right? They either destroyed their developments, they've put them under RAD, or, the Resident Assistance Administration Program. It's basically under private sector management. They never had much to begin with, right? And why that matters is that if you want federal legislation, you need allies, right? And it used to be that there were, like, Chicago, Baltimore, Philly a little bit, Boston. There were these large public housing authorities, right, that had these large portfolios that kind of looked a little like, not as big, but in terms of, the big superblock projects and, it's the capital needs and the operating subsidy needs, right? That this was kind of the, this was like there was a national component, right? That is no longer much of a case, right? There are still public housing projects in other, cities, but they're on different forms of management. They're much smaller. They can meet, for instance, with the RAD program, many cities can meet a lot of their capital and operating needs by participating in RADs, transferring over to Section 8, right? Because it's not that big. There's limits placed on how many developments can go into RAD, right? So with cities that have small portfolios, they can do a lot with RAD, but New York, not so much, right? I mean, we're getting there, but it's relatively small. So you have an enormous portfolio of housing. You have basically a federal government that since the 1970s has put all of its emphasis on public-private partnerships, whether through Section 8, the low-income housing tax credits, right? Now RAD, right? They push. They want the end of a traditional public housing authority like NYCHA. That's been basically the public policy of the federal government. And they're really the only ones who provided any money for public housing in significant ways. City and state have not done it. You can't really, it's been very difficult to put together a statewide movement for public housing in New York City for obvious reasons. Again, there's very little public housing left in New York State outside of New York City, and much of that has been redeveloped actually across the board. So it's even hard, even at the state level, right, to get any funding. And then at the city level, the mayoral programs have all emphasized either preservation of the public-private partnership developments like Mitchell-Lama, right, or early versions of low-income housing tax credit stuff now, right, or the construction of new mixed income models, right. The other issue is that NYCHA is not a city agency, right, and people always say, oh, it's city. It's not. It's an authority, right, and it's not part of the regular budget process. They are not able to make, I have made the case, I've tried many times, that NYCHA should be able to make a case in the capital budgets for the state of good repair so that they're not left over at the end like, oh, do we have anything left for NYCHA? No, well, sorry, I guess everyone got the cash, right? And the only reason the city provides any money now is because the federal government, HUD, stepped in the Trump administration and was like, because of the controversies over lead and things like that, basically that's the agreement, right? The consent decree on that. So you don't have I think in New York City, you don't have the political kind of will in people who are not in NYCHA, right, to fix NYCHA. They'd much rather read in the daily news about some new or the city now or whatever it is, right? They'd much rather read about some horrible, thing that happened at NYCHA rather than look square in the face, which is that there are, there's some malfeasance or all that sort of stuff. But the truth is that public housing is a political entity. All right. People have to understand that. Well, 50 years ago, it was a real estate operation. Okay. It's not a real estate operation anymore. Right. When the rents of tenants covered the operations and the financing for those, for some of the long-term financing and the development of these, it was a real estate operation. But now it's a political entity with a strong social mission. So when I mentioned, it's $500 to rent a NYCHA apartment, that's not what it costs to maintain a NYCHA apartment. Not even close. It's probably $1,500 at this point, right, with fuel costs and things like that. So you're taking a loss on every apartment, right? And when you're taking a loss because we want to have low-cost apartments. But the key is who is going to pay for the difference between what it costs to maintain, to operate, and also capitalize these projects, right? And what people can legitimately pay as 30% of their income. And the only way you're going to get that money is through politics at this point, right? Well, that's that's either you're going to get it from politics or you're going to have to look at things like, shifting programs like to the RAD program, right? Or this trust, right? Which will basically leverage NYCHA to finance basically renovations, right? So, but that's a political process in itself. So, that's I guess, I don't know if that answers the question you're looking for at all. But.
Well, let's, I think that, and before we go to others, one last question.
We got a bunch, you got a bunch more here, I think.
Yeah, but before we switch on, I want to let folks have their opportunity to ask questions and I know weigh in and put some thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure.
But before we do that, and you're talking about politics, and it would be a good moment to note today's decision, at least legislative decision. The Public Housing Preservation Trust passes the legislature in New York State. Do you want to say a few words about what that means, or at least what we're hearing and understanding about that at this point?
Well, if it works, and if they can attract using the Section 9 or Section 8 financing scheme they've come up with, right? If it works, then it could basically bring in enormous amounts of investment into renovating NYCHA and then having basically a public manager at the tail end, unlike RAD or PACT, where you basically turn it over to private sector for development and then management. It's not saying there's not unintended consequences of something like this, right? But again, when you look around at what the options are at this point, had, for instance, the Build Back Better with a large provision for NYCHA passed, you wouldn't need it, right? But it didn't pass, right? And we've, for those of us who've been around public housing in terms of research for, I guess I started in about 2003. The dream of federal funding, it's like every year they're like, well, we can't do this because the federal government will pay for it. But in the end, they never do. They just don't. The only time they came up with a big chunk of money was Sandy. That was it. That's when you got some money. And with the destruction, and so forth. Are we really going to wait? And you kind of have like a slow moving Sandy, right? Otherwise, so this is going on, right? Disinvestment moving forward. So in my view, NYCHA has always followed the money. And what basically they're doing is it's an acknowledgement that the federal policy is this, is Section 8 is better funded than Section 9. And Section 8 is better funded than Section 9 because there's a private sector partnership, right? So you can ignore that, as NYCHA has for many years, that sort of thing, or basically just start following the money. So the way I look at it is it's like, it's not really about the state, because the state doesn't put up anything in this, right? State doesn't have any skin. It's like, how do we get the federal cash, right? Okay, Biden said they'd do some public health, but they didn't do it, right? So where is the money? It's all about kind of like, so what do we have, kind of create this trust so you can get this cash, right? And then you got the RAD program, PACT, right? That's another, pot of money. Because again, the portfolio is so big, right? And the needs are so enormous. You'll have to follow every bit of cash you can, right? To even maintain a roof over people's heads over time. I mean, that's my view. That's just my opinion. I mean, based on the history of NYCHA, which is that they've always followed the money. They've always followed the money. And when you stop following the money, that's when you have problems, right? When you're like, this is just what it's going to be. It's going to be exactly like this. We're never going to, have a private sector component or blah, blah, blah. And everyone else in the country is going off on these tangents, right? But New York, we're not going to do that. Well, guess what happened? The federal government penalized New York. Think of all the money, we're missing. So that's my view is it's really of a piece with how NYCHA has always operated. They've always followed whatever the federal government was offering.
So on that note, I think we'll pause there and allow folks some time to ask questions. Ms. Coleman, I saw your hand up first. Do you want to offer some thoughts and insight, questions too?
Hi.
And good evening. It's nice to see you.
Good evening.
Greetings all. Yeah, I don't really have any questions. Very interesting talk, I'll say. You and I, sir, was featured in an article by Rachel Holiday Smith in February of 2021 with the city. What is NYCHA, that piece she had, What is NYCHA? You gave your expertise of your studies and as a scholar, as they say you are, so I'll say that's what you are. And I was able to give my lived experience as well as firsthand knowledge of how it has changed throughout the decades, and where we are at presently. I'm also a CUNY student for Public Housing Residents. It's a scholarship program.
Oh, that's a great program. Yeah.
Resident Leadership Academy. So we did study the history of public housing and so forth. And we're still doing different things within that. It's a 4-course program. But one of the things, the fact is, I know people, we look at the median income of public housing, but then it also diverts from people of different incomes, because NYCHA is filled with low to moderate income people. So I just wanted to stress that. And we pay 30% of our income. So with that said, and as many essential workers there, I was a former municipality worker myself. We have school teachers, police officers, civil servants, and so forth. So it's not just, people that are on public assistance. And we do understand how things have changed throughout the year. But unfortunately, living in NYCHA is very similar to living in the tenements back then, now. Yeah. This is, and for it to have been built, and also I feel NYCHA was greedy. The authority was greedy because they took over some tenements. And correct me if I'm wrong, to add into their portfolio. So that was a form of greed, and they couldn't manage that. And now, and the portfolio all the buildings that they did construct. But that's one of the problems. And we know the disinvestment, right, from the city, state, and federal government. So the lack of funding, but we also have to look at the white flight, what took place. And that was also a factor of why we are not just in New York City, but throughout public housing throughout the city, because there's Black and brown people majority in there at this moment, because we weren't able to get the loans and so forth to leave. So that's another factor. And it's it's racist, let's call it what it is. It's racist. And our elected officials are not, stepping up and standing by us and investing the money that we need. I'll go on record. If we could spend billions for war, we shouldn't have people homeless. We shouldn't have people living in the conditions that public housing residents are living in. And I'll stop at the point of crime. When I was in the seminary, I had someone come out and speak to the class, and when they spoke about crime, they always pinpointed on public housing, but it's not necessarily that people might come there and do things, but it's not like, all of the residents or we are bad people, because we're not, but that might be a place that people could come do things and get away with things or run into our buildings and so forth. But, we do not use projects. It feels for us, it feels derogatory. Some of us do, but I don't, use it. I say public housing or NYCHA. So, but thank you for your talk. It was interesting, and I knew about you, and I was, like I said, in a piece, and I'll drop the link in the chat. So
I put it. I asked Zachary to put it in. I
It
asked
was a
Zachary
great,
to
it was a
put the
great
link
article.
in.
Thanks, Sandra.
Okay.
I asked Zachary to put the link in the chat. It's an article from the city, and actually, that's how Andrea, I knew you were going to be on, and that's how I found the professor. And I thought this would be a nice time for us to learn from each other. So the link, the link is in the chat.
It was a fun interview with her, and I didn't even know she just talked to me for about an hour. I never knew that it was going to be a piece with Mr. Bloom, Professor Bloom, and until it came out. So that was cool. So all right. Thank you.
Sandra, thanks. Those are all really good points. And, when I go over a fast history like that, it's hard to hit every point, but I just want to stress a few things for those who are listening, right? I think at this point, only about 13% of public housing residents are on public assistance. About over 40% are working families, as you mentioned. There is a range of income, even though in general, I mean, it's as I said, it's about 24,000 on average across the system. And I agree also with your point that, the disinvestment in public housing, there is a racialized component to it. When public housing was primarily white in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, it was a very well-funded program. The developments were built to high quality standards. There was a housing police, extensively and things like that. So security was maintained in a different way, and the developments were maintained in other ways. And I think that you're right, that the racial change provided kind of cover for politicians to basically not invest in public housing. And to this day, right, I think it would look very different if there were 400,000 white people living in public housing in New York. I think it'd be a very different discussion.
Yeah, you're right. And I'm against the trust. And I wanted to say this, and then I'm gonna be quiet because I know the hands up.
Right.
When we talk about the political aspect, there's a saying that we don't vote, and that's not always true. And I'm not saying that you said it, but that's not always true. And then also from Holmes and Isaacs, out of the 68th Assembly District, all the public housing developments, we're the best voting block.
That's
those
great.
5 buildings statistically. And, these elected officials come to us and pander for votes, but then when they get in office, they don't remember us. So You're right about the political aspect. And I'm going to be quiet and yield for others. Thank you.
No problem. I think it's a good conversation.
That was great. I feel like we brought
the
article to life, right? I feel like we brought the article from the city to life in real time right there. That was great. Sorry, Professor, go ahead.
I was just going to say also, one of the factors probably in good turnout too, is that you have a very large senior population too in public housing. So I think that's also very often overlooked, how crucial public housing is as a home to seniors. And also senior headed households in particular. It's a crucial housing resource in that way.
Huge. I see Rita Popper's hand is up. Question, thoughts, and insight. Rita, the floor is yours.
Nicholas, this has been fabulous. Thank you so very much. I just have a question. Who does NYCHA report to? And the reason I'm asking the question is that when we read about that NYCHA gets X amount of dollars to do a lead paint study, the study is never done, but the money, nobody knows where the money is. So the money seems to, in NYCHA now, seems to go in a dark hole. The same thing with boilers. It kills me that right here in New York City, that there are people who have children or elderly people who don't have hot water in the winter and don't have heat in the winter. Who is responsible for it?
Okay. Yeah, I can answer that. That's a great question, and a legit question. All right, so from a just there's a number of things they're responsible for. One is there is a federal oversight now. There is a legal office. If you're interested in reading really hard-hitting reports on NYCHA, go to the federal monitorship. Okay, Rita, and you will see hundreds and hundreds of pages. They do monthly analysis of what's going on internally in NYCHA, and it's public. So you can see both what works and what doesn't, in terms of these sorts of issues. The authorities chair and the board is mayorally appointed. And, even though it's an independent authority, essentially the mayors have enormous control there. However, from a reporting point of view, NYCHA reports to HUD, right? It's a creature of the federal government. Okay, so that's sort of the thing. As for whether no money gets spent, I would like to correct that, because I've known a lot of people who work in capital, very good. In fact, the former VP of capital. There is a lot of boiler replacement, particularly related to Sandy work and things that have been done. I think you get into sort of like with the reporting that's done that nothing ever gets done. But the truth is, there's enormous roof replacements that have been done. There are enormous boiler, there's a whole boiler. If you've ever been to a NYCHA boiler room, it's crazy big and expensive. Like they're insane, right? They look like the insides of ships. So it's not that nothing is getting done. It's just that if they do one project, it's a tens of millions of dollars project, right? And then you have all the other 160 developments, right? So it's also the scale problem, right? Which is that, the Sandy projects have moved forward very well. And I say this, by the way, objectively, you can go look at the monitorship and things like that to see that the capital programs have moved forward very nicely, but that's only the ones that flooded, right? If you weren't lucky enough to get flooded, right, you didn't get access to the $3 billion in capital funding, right? So in this bizarro world we live in, right, the people who were most hurt, right, in Sandy, right, with the flooding and so forth, are the ones that actually got finally, the federal government cracked open the piggy bank a little bit, put some money in, but most developments do not get that money, right? So what's been going on at NYCHA for many years is a kind of, triage. If you want, the metaphor I've used, and I think it's very accurate for NYCHA is, in Cuba, they're still running 1950s automobiles down there, right? That's NYCHA. That's a NYCHA boiler room, right? Like you can kind of make it go, but I wouldn't recommend it. Like it's hard to get parts. I mean, think about the subway, same thing, right? They've got switches that aren't made anymore, right? So that's, on the one hand, yes, there are issues, I think, about accountability in both the service staff and people who run places. There's been a flight of talent over the years because of all the negative things that have happened. That's a real thing, okay? That's a real thing. But then you have the inability to repair and replace equipment on a regular basis. So that's another problem, right? And then you have the people who are trying to hold it together, which, is, again, with aging equipment, inadequate resources, you will have failure. There's just no way around it, right? And so there will be no change in this, right, unless NYCHA becomes an adequately funded and fully renovated system, right? Because it's just a Band-Aid. It's like Band-Aid. It's constant Band-Aidism. Like there's always like a new, administrative, like they're like, we're going to reorganize, the the way we do it. It's like, well, okay, but there's not enough maintenance people, right? Or there's not the right equipment anymore, right? Or this thing's just plain broken. I'm gonna give you a real example on the heating thing. Like, it's not just the boilers. The whole distribution network at NYCHA is pretty broken, right? Where the heat goes out, because you have these centralized heating plants, right? So you can have like a modern, so they'll replace like a heating plant, right? But that doesn't mean you're going to get good heat, right? Because if the pipes that it goes out to in a development, right, and it goes up to an apartment aren't right, you've got a big problem, right? And that's just one example. Another example are the aging water pipes and refuse pipes in NYCHA developments, right? They need to be replaced, like not just cleaned, right? It's that time. And anyone who's in an apartment building knows that at a certain point you're throwing good money after bad, right? When you're not just replacing equipment. But NYCHA labors under a system that basically, they have contracting issues. They have to pay a very high price for whatever they do. And so they haven't replaced equipment at a rate that really would keep things at this high level. So, I mean, but I would correct the idea that like there's nobody good at NYCHA and nobody cares. It's just not true. There's 11,000 people. Many of them are wonderful. I have known many people, both in frontline staff, people who work, as caretakers. There are a lot of people who care, but what they're up against is extremely difficult. And the same goes for the subway. Right, it's akin to that, right? It is very similar to that sort of system, an underinvested system that is a crucial resource in the city for people, but has just been underinvested in years. I would encourage you to think about it that way.
Let's let some other folks who have hands up get a question in. Boaz Galil, do you want to jump in?
Great stuff. I learned a lot, and I agree 100% with what you said so far. I have, first of all, a question and an idea that I want to run by you. First of all, a question that I hope that you will answer before the meeting ends. Let's say that the money will not come. We all agree the public housing need more money. Let's say that the billions of dollars will not come. They will send to Ukraine, they will send to other places. The money will not come. What are the options? Okay, and what will happen? Give us some kind of prediction. Let's say that if there is not going to be a miracle, what will happen?
Sure.
How many years? That's the first. That's the question. The idea that I have, I think that the entire public housing, the problem is it's all about marketing and promoting the idea of the public housing. And I want to give you my thinking is that yesterday there was the community board had a meeting about a new hospital tower that they are building in Upper East Side. There were over 100 people participate, including many people from the community board that joined that yesterday meeting. Why? Because it impacts everyone in the community because it's going to take parking spot. Today, you can see that there is less people in the meeting because the public housing does not impact. For example, it doesn't impact me. I'm in the market rate rent, and I think that just like what they've done with the childcare in New York City, they said that basically childcare a few years ago they started the program 3K. Sure. That every child in New York City get a free, every family with a child at 3 years old get a free childcare. And of course, then they added all the low income programs for families without a lot of money, and they added extended childcare, and they added Head Start, all kind of program, but they say it's for everyone. So everyone now has the attention, everyone loves this program, and they added a lot of programs for people without money. I think that the same thing needs to happen for public housing. For example, now
let's
just one sentence. That's it. I will. For example, market rate rent. I got today why I'm pissed because I got today a contract 20%. increase in rate
Yeah.
in rent. If the solution would include everyone, including myself, I have money, but 20% increase in 1 year, you know, so that's my opinion. We shouldn't look at this, oh, those people, the public housing, I don't live in public housing, it's not my problem.
Right.
We should look at this as a universal thing. That's it. Thank you.
They're really good points. They're really interesting points. Well, one thing, I mean, while the general public may not be, you know, on this, there's 250,000 families on the NYCHA waiting list. So obviously, no matter how many awful articles they write about how terrible public housing is, truth is not everyone's buying it because they know that being in the private sector, right? You know, it's not $500 rents and 30% of your income maximum and so forth, right? So I actually think you're right on that, you know, that's something that needs to be talked about to a certain extent. You know, the marketing side, I guess if NYCHA doesn't really have sort of a marketing piece, I mean, they do, they have their newsletter and stuff like, but they don't have a kind of money that, you know, other organizations have to sort of market themselves. But I do agree that the housing authority or those who support public housing, and I've tried through books and exhibits to basically show the value that people have in their apartments. Like we did a whole exhibit at Hunter showing like how different apartment interiors, we actually built models. And, you know, we showed that these are really nice apartments, right? They need to be maintained better, but they're, you know, they're good apartments and that they should be maintained. And there are these values there. It's hard to put forward. I mean, I think the other piece is that, you know, I think the average tenancy in public housing is something like 24 years. The vacancy rate is 1.9 or 2%. So the idea of basically turnover, who lives in public housing, you know, I mean, it's a reality that people who get into public housing stay because of the deal, but it's what they can afford. There's nothing in between that and a market rent. And so ultimately that means that certain people are going to benefit much more from public housing than the general public. I personally don't have a problem with that myself, but there are people who do. You know, I don't really have a problem with the idea, like, if you want to stay in New York City, like, it's smart to stay in public housing, right? I think that public housing residents are some of the smartest people you've met. They've got one of the best deals in the country, if you ask me. You can live in Chelsea, you know, somebody across the street is paying $6,000 for a unit that's 1/3 the cost, right? But I do think that does create a kind of, you know, I think that does create something of a public relations issue for a lot of people who are like, well, why should I have to pay this and someone not, and so forth. I don't think there's like an abundance of, because it's not a universal system, like you were mentioning pre-K, right? That's something that everybody can benefit, but we've stopped building public housing. We build a small amount of affordable housing. So it is a scarce resource. So I think that does create a different kind of image, right? An idea of public housing versus something like pre-K, which was, you know, massively rolled out, massively expanded, accessible to all. So, I mean, I think the only way to really have the kind of, I'm just sort of thinking on my feet here, but to have, when public housing had that kind of better reputation, it was an expanding system, which many more people thought they'd get access to. Where now it's like 250,000 people on a waiting list, it can be 8-10 years before you get there. Right. So the only way I think to really change it would be to build more public housing, which we don't have, you know, obviously not the money for and things like that. But I think that when it was like this expanding, growing, you know, new system, you know, like the housing was new, then, you know, like it was more positively viewed. Right.
I see Sarah Lynch has a hand up. Sarah?
Hi, yes. First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Bloom. You have edified, and I'll be honest with you, you've got a lot of acronyms that I would have to go look up that I really don't know. So I'm pretty new to this, but I feel very strongly about this subject. So a lot of good points have been brought up in regard to the situation. Talent, I think, is number one. You cannot run any of these programs without talent. You need talent, okay? Marketing, I believe that is a very good call because it's how you're marketing this to, you know, you use the example of you're in Chelsea, you have a $6,000 apartment and somebody across the street has a $2,000 apartment. So how do you justify that? But that's marketing, okay?
Yeah.
But my number one thing is, okay, it's a numbers game. We have a census. We know what the average income is. We know the people who make above and below the average income. Technically, maybe not actually, but technically, we know the number of apartments within New York City, okay? We know that number exists. We know what the average price is for those apartments. So the real thing here, and you've covered this, so many points have been covered, so many points could be addressed here. The administration, you're talking about different governmental administrations, slow moving, inertia comes to mind. All of that has to be transformed. All of that would have to be centralized, which is not a good, that's not a good term, but you need somebody with a lot of talent who can negotiate between the private sector and the funds. The funds out there are available somewhere as long as it's enumerated. And if you had the answer to this, you would be making $1 gazillion a year. But those are my call outs. There's so many things here, but
well, Sarah, I think
is talent.
I think you've made a good point. And that's kind of like, if you look at where the money and talent and energy is because of federal policy, it's been in the private sector side. And that's one reason why, like these rad PAC programs get like nice articles in newspapers, get the positive PR, because they're looking at a NYCHA project in a very different way, right? They're like, what do we have to do to make this place look good, right? And function better for residents on an economical basis. And, then they get a nice write-up in the New York Times, basically illustrating that kind of transformation. And I think that's partly what's driving, why the trust thing is moving forward, is that it's a similar idea, which is like, if we get enough, and I think you're right on, Sarah, talent follows money, right? And if NYCHA when NYCHA had a lot of money decades ago, they had a lot of talent, much more talented administrators, many more, who were willing to, work and develop and maintain public housing. And, I think as money flows back in, it will also attract talent again. And I have students, for instance, I can just say my planning students, I run the planning program, and I always encourage the smart students and so forth to at least start out, give NYCHA a shot, right? And work there for a while. And many of them have very good careers there and very interesting, because there are places you can really make a difference in that authority. So thanks, this is a great point.
Let's let Lakeisha question or thought.
Hi, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I think he just kind of sort of made my point for me, is that basically when NYCHA had the money, they had the good planners who tried to do good things. Because as a person who lives in NYCHA, I was raised here on the Upper East Side in the Homes Towers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of the co-founders of the Homes Isaac Coalition. I remember a time when NYCHA actually was targeting people for better, who had more working families, who that's what they really wanted, because they wanted to boost up their portfolios with people who were working more so that they can get more, let's say, more revenue into NYCHA. But the problem is that, they have squandered so much of the money that they did have. And the problem with the going to the private sector with these private partnerships is that the private partnerships, many of the people who live in the developments are being evicted. So that's why people who live in NYCHA really do not want to go with the RAD PAC deal. So we understand that getting, money through private sectors is a great idea, but, it is scary for people who live here. And when you go from Section 9 to Section 8, you cannot, you lose a lot of your protection. So, that is also not explained to people who live in NYCHA. So it sounds like a great idea, and it's great for NYCHA, but it's not necessarily great for the people who live there. So it brings in revenue, but it's the quality of the life of the people. That's not going to be good, and we can't build any new public housing because of the Faircloth Act that doesn't allow true affordable housing. And that's what we really need to be looking at, because when you want to call, affordable housing and the rent is, your minimum, income, your mean income is like $95,000, that's ridiculous.
That's even low, Lakeisha. There's much higher.
I know, because that's what they're doing up in Harlem. And nobody's making that. People are really not making that. A single mother of 3 is not making that. And then they're not even making apartments bigger than a 2-bedroom.
Oh yeah, they're small. Again, the new ones are really small. Yeah.
Exactly, because you're already saying who you want to live in this apartment. And then if it is for low income, you have to come in through a second door. So you need to stop with that bullshit. I'm sorry. That's ridiculous. You understand? Now you're telling me I'm low income and you're telling me I'm second class all in one shot. That's really demeaning. So,
well, Lakeisha, I think you've hit it on the head, which is that there's a risk. The risk of not taking these programs, right, is the continuous disinvestment and decline. The risk of taking them, and I agree with you, right, there is an unknown there, right, which is that they say all the protections are the same, blah, 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 but we don't know yet, right? There's some indications that evictions are up, but we don't have, because it's private sector run, right, we don't have the same kind of data we get from NYCHA. Right, so we don't really know. It kind of goes into when you move these developments into the private sector management side, you lose a lot of information.
You don't lose the information. NYCHA hides the information. They double talk the information. Yeah. They listen to what their residents are saying, and then they double talk it, because they promise you a seat at the table, but they don't promise you change. And we've seen it before, because this is what they're saying. Oh, you can come and you can have a seat when we make these decisions, but then they tell you, but your decisions are never truly final. There is documentation, because there was just a study of like 100 and some odd people out in Queens about how many people were evicted from the development that was just done out there. So their new developments have a higher eviction rate. It's not unknown. This is what they do, because again, once you move from Section 9 to Section 8 and you're under new development, you're under private developments, you're underneath their rules and regulations. You do not have the same protections.
So Lakeisha, what do you see? Okay, if it's not this trust and it's not RAD packed, I mean, what do you see? I mean, as a resident, what do you see as the way to kind of, renovate and get the capital needed for public housing?
NYCHA has to open up their books. That's number one. They have to open up their books, and we really need to see what they're doing. You understand? Because again, they are their own authority and they make their own rules. I think that's the first thing. We really have to see where the money is going, where they're bleeding. And I think we can go from there. We can do resident Managements, that's another way too, because we have very talented people who are very capable of running their own developments. And we can start again. Like, we have to look where this money is going. That's where I think we need to really look and see where they're bleeding and why they're bleeding so badly.
Okay, thanks.
I would love to have Marco jump in with a question or a thought.
Thank you, Greg. Professor, first of all, I have to do an introduction of myself. Yeah, I'm a licensed architect. Yes, actually I should start from the beginning. I'm an alumni from Hunter. And my professor was Silence, Professor Silence, probably you replaced him. And always I have a debate with him in housing. And I would like to make two questions to you and then my statement. My first question is, what is the definition of affordable housing? Or how do you view what it is affordable housing? Because that clarifies many issues that I hear right now tonight.
Oh, you want me to define it?
Yeah.
It's
not kind of
I think it's I mean, my view is that it has shifted. I'm a historian, right? So my view is that every generation kind of defines who are the beneficiaries of particular housing programs. And you can look in the 30s. There were big arguments in the 1930s about who deserved public housing or not. And there was a lot of criticism of NYCHA even in the 30s that they were housing tenants who could find housing, for instance, in the private market as opposed to public. So what I think defines it today and why I think it's become complicated is that since the 1980s in particular, the focus, and I sort of stress this again, the focus on in the federal level, which is still the main source of all housing policy in the United States, has been on the public-private partnership. And that has essentially defined affordable housing as a public policy that legitimately generates profits for the private sector. The profit is not a bug, it's a feature, right? As a result, and so one is that you have the profit. The other, it has been based on the idea of mixed income models, right? That's another sort of key element of what defines affordability, so that it's not just one income range, it's a range of income levels within a building. And that was a response to class stratification in public housing. So that's another factor. And let me think, those are the main thing. It's profit, mixed income. Oh, and the last is that the federal government in general, except for Section 8 and public housing, but in a new affordable housing, they don't want to provide an annual operating and capital subsidy, okay? So when you put those three things together, we're definitely in an age, and I think Lakeisha was very eloquent on this, right? We're definitely in an age when what is considered affordable is not really driven necessarily by people's need, right? But what the program basically defines as an acceptable return and rent level under the mode of production, if that makes sense, right? So really the rent levels are driven by the policy, and the policy says there'll be profit, right? There'll be mixed income, and there will be no underlying federal subsidy for this on an annual basis or capital basis, right? And so when a developer sits down, right, with these three elements, they have a sheet, right? And they run the numbers, right? And that's why we're in the problem we are in now, right? Which is that when they run their numbers in New York on expensive land costs and construction costs, what the federal government will and will not provide, then they're like, well, this is what the rents will be. And, those rents are high. They're really high. Even at the lower end, they're high. They're not $500 a month by and large, except in certain very sort of the lowest levels. So that's again, it's a result of a political decision. Could the federal government put up the money to develop high quality, low cost public housing in the United States? Could the state government do that? Could the city government do it? Yes, they could do it. And as other people pointed out, they have money for guns or whatever else, right? Yes, they could do it, but they don't. And that is the America we live in, right? So unless there's some sea change, right, in national policy or state policy or city policy, we are stuck with this particular model of affordability.
That directly, I think you're missing is when you put money in the process, you're telling right away size of the unit, because and then you put in right another thing, the big disparity
good point.
between the income that right now. So the living conditions is right now is out of control. I mean, I feel sorry for those low income families that at this time the inflation is out of control.
Right.
This is a shame for all the politicians, especially right now the Democrats that are in the power, because they're supposed to control that part. Many people probably they don't need to now because the cost of living is excessively very expensive, and that directly leads to the cost of the housing. And housing is exactly the same. So to give an idea in housing, because we have to be specific in housing.
Marco, I don't want to stop you. You're rolling, but I was going to say if we can end closer to 8. So if your question is close by, that would be great.
Okay,
I want to get to Rita because her hand is up. But I don't want to cut you off. But if you have your questions,
the second question is the density. What is what you consider high density area, and what is low density? You already mentioned 1,000 people per acre, right, and 200 in the development of NYCHA. And what do you consider an average, or what do you consider a very high?
Well, I mean, that number of about 1,000 was sort of like the dense tenements, let's say, 1900 or 1920 or something like that. NYCHA developments are not, at least officially, are certainly not densely developed compared to the tenements. And that's intentional, right? They resisted adding, and also because the program itself didn't pay for a lot of units in that period. So in general,
what will be the number?
What's that?
What will be the number
for high density?
What do you
we see? If you want to see this, actually, can I recommend? We did a whole show on this, Marco, at the Skyscraper Museum called Housing Density, and we laid out the range of, and in fact, it's a website now. So we laid out a whole range of housing densities. From very low density, like Co-op City at like 150, to some of the places west of the High Line, where they're getting to 900 and 1,000 units per acre or something like that. So, I encourage you to look at that site. That's what I'll say.
Thank you. I will look it up. Now, that's my statement. Now, so the issue, what I perceive is, you're absolutely right. If we want to do something in housing, we have, let me start saying, 40 billion of deficit. That's the books of NYCHA, $40 billion. That is the deficit. Who's going to give you a penny? Whose lender is going to give a penny? No lender is going to give a penny.
That's not true, Marco.
Well, the only thing they will give you the federal government.
No, the way it works, like for instance, I can tell you, there's a couple of ways you can access capital. I mean, yes, the federal government has capital funding. The city is providing actually probably more capital funding on an annual basis than federal government at this point because of the consent decree. But the other thing is that what's happening is, so under the RAD PACT program, the developers basically are handed these developments, right? Private sector is handed these developments mostly without underlying mortgages. They are not required to pay taxes on the sites. They go out and borrow money from the private sector to renovate them. They know that they have the public housing commitment funds underlying them. Under the trust model, which is moving forward, what's going to happen is NYCHA is going to create this trust they will, it's still under NYCHA's control, but what they will do is the same kind of process, but they will move the developments from what's called Section 9 to Section 8, and they will borrow, essentially, they will be borrowing against future Section 8 payments. And so there are private sector lenders who will, we believe, I mean, by the way, we don't know for sure, but there will private sector lenders who will basically finance renovation of NYCHA developments because they know that there is a guaranteed income stream from the Section 8
That is correct. That is exactly the NYCHA went to the state requesting to obtain that money, and that's basically still within in the state. They didn't go to the bank. Yes, true. Yes, you can lend money in expectancy that you change from Section 9 to Section 8. Why? Because they know that there are many people that live in those developments. They really, really deserve to be there. Others probably not, and that's Section 8.
That's not what drives it, Marco. Marco, what drives it?
Every single year in Section 8, Section 9, you never qualify.
I'll tell you what, I wanted to, Greg and I, we'd like to hard stop with Rita, but this is a great conversation. We'd definitely love to have you back. This has been very, very informative. I've learned.
Yeah, I just want to stress
I've learned a ton tonight.
Yeah, and the Section 8 program provides a larger monthly support per apartment. That's one reason why they believe that the private sector will fund this.
Okay. No, well, I appreciate that. Listen, no, I mean, I want to have you back. Like I said, this is just
it's fun
information.
And great. By the way, great. I really enjoyed all the comments. They're very interesting. I learned a lot. So thank you very much.
You're not done yet because we still have Rita.
All right, Rita, hit me again with something.
Yeah, that's right. And poor Rita's been waiting very patiently because when you go for one time, and
Keisha's up there too.
Rita knows why. Rita, it's all yours.
Nicholas, whatever course you're giving, I'm signing up for. I have to tell you, my background is Mitchell Lama. And of course, we lost 100,000 apartments right here in New York City, literally within a few months or a few years of each other. But I have a question, and it has nothing to do with, it has everything to do with it. Has anybody, I'm sure they have, the thought of what happens if we don't have affordable housing, if we don't make affordable housing, and what's going to happen in 25 years from now if we don't have affordable housing? Let me give you my very quick reason for asking this. In China,
Rita, let's let Nicholas weigh in, because just for the sake of time, is that okay?
All right. Well, I mean, there will be. I mean, I think you brought up Mitchell Lama, and it's a great example. To the extent which the government is willing to recapitalize, right? You know, whether it was Mitchell Lama or public housing or a lot of these affordable housing developments, right, are going to time out, you know, in 20 or even earlier, right? A lot of them are timing out. So it will, again, I come back to the political component of it, right? There will be, it's going to be it's never not going to be a fight to maintain this housing. I mean, I guess that's it, right? I mean, you can look at how many decades it took Mary Simkovich to get public housing off the ground to begin with, but it's always under threat. And I think part of the reason is that there is so much embedded power in the real estate industry, right? In the kind of, you know, free market ideology, right? At particularly the federal level, right? So it's very hard it's always going to be a fight because New York is different in maintaining such a large portfolio of, you know, publicly supported. We have the largest Section 8 program in the country. It's always going to be a fight, right? And it's going to take, you know, the federal officials or, you know, the elected officials from New York State. It's going to take New York City officials. It's going to take state officials. It's going to take everybody to maintain, even just maintain, right, the system. Because you always see, for instance, you know, the ability to add units is very hard. right? It's always more preservation than additions of new affordable units, but even to preserve them is a very expensive operation. So I share your concern. I do believe, though, that considering New York's almost like 100 years into this thing, if you look at the State Housing Act of 1926, we're almost there, right? Of 100 years, it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. And then you have all the people who live in public housing and affordable housing who are a large political constituency. I think that's crucial. So, I mean, I'm relatively optimistic. I wrote a whole book on how states shape post-war America. I have a whole section on Mitchell-Lama in there, which was a very interesting program. And Rita, if you email me, I'll be happy to send you a copy of the book. But the other side of it is sometimes New York has to just do its own thing. I mean, if you look at this $25 billion state program, I mean, that's really big in the American context, right? So, I mean, that's, I don't even think California comes close, right, in basically underlining and basically subsidizing housing. So I'm reasonably confident that the scale of it, plus I think you have a lot of people who are in rent stabilization, who are natural allies of people who are in constructed affordable housing. So I think there'll be there's clearly going to be a reckoning. There already have been improvements in protections for renters. I think that's a natural, and that's about 1 million units. So I think that there is a strong constituency for, the public intervention in private housing markets in New York. I don't know about the rest of the country, but things are going bad in Florida, so you never know, right? I mean, it is interesting to sort of watch, for me, sort of watch the affordability crisis spread. And people are like, well, this is terrible, we should do something. But, New York does have 100 years of experience of really doing things on a big scale. And I actually think, that's maybe that as affordability becomes worse in other places, right, that will have an important effect in changing the national conversation. I would hope, I don't know,
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so Andrea, this is like our encore. This is it's the last. Everybody's had the lighters up, and last question.
She can have the last word.
You
can have the last word, Andrea.
I'm dating myself.
But I thought somebody else was up, but okay.
I know Lakeisha was up, and she's like, "Oh, the band's not coming back."
Okay.
But they came back. So
okay, it's okay. No,
the band is back.
I just wanted to say that when I was a payroll supervisor with NYPD and I did some income affidavits for Mitchell-Lama residents, it was similar. The similar breakdown that NYCHA uses, they use. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to say my observations is that Mitchell-Lamas are now like NYCHA in a sense, and living in NYCHA is comparable to residing in the old tenements regarding the living conditions.
Interesting.
So I just wanted to put that, that's what I see. And from what I know, you referenced Co-op City a lot, and I know people up there and, just the conditions throughout the city. And with Mitchell-Lamas, they are deteriorating, and they're actually battling for their rights as well. So I just want
that's a really good, they should be natural allies of public housing, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, instead of dividing up the programs. That's a good point.
Yeah, thank you.
On behalf of the Housing Committee, Professor Bloom, this has been fantastic. To our committee members, everybody who's joined us this evening, I think this has been a robust, interesting conversation. It had back and forth. It had lots of follow-up. I suspect we could keep going, but for the sake of
don't you want to talk about public housing all night? My wife does not want to hear any more about public housing.
Imagine.
We can talk as long as you want. I've got time now.
You've been phenomenal. Thank you so much to everyone who's participated in this. Once again, Professor Bloom, our congrats and our thanks. Good luck to you, by the way, on your new book, Great American Transit Disaster, March of 2023.
Yeah,
we have that in the chat.
Plug that in the chat as we can plug that in the chat as well, because we want to make sure we all get a copy when it's out. You take on all the big systems, mass transit, public housing.
I'm interested in large institutional sort of like systems.
Well, we thank you for your work and your effort and all your time tonight. You've been phenomenal.
All right,
everybody. Ed, do we need to ask for the ability to close this meeting out?
Anybody want to? We'll certainly entertain that. Is that Sandrea? Does that recognize you? Is that a motion to dismiss or to adjourn? Yes, I'm sure. And I see Sarah, a lot of thumbs. Yeah, I think we have that.
Good night, everybody. Be well, be
Thanks,
safe.
everyone.
Thank you very much. Once again, Professor Bloom, thank you.
Yeah, okay.